Jodi Picoult was born on Long Island and moved to New Hampshire with her family when she was 13. So I'd say she's from New Hampshire now. She studied creative writing at Princeton and received a Master's of Education from Harvard. And she's been honored with awards ranging from our own New England Independent Booksellers Award to the New Hampshire Literary Award for Outstanding Literary Merit. Her books have been translated into 34 languages in 35 countries. 4 of them have been made into television movies, and of course, My Sister's Keeper was a big screen release. We hope that this morning is going to be a fabulous send-off for Jodi as she begins her book tour for Small Great Things, her 24th novel. Her first novel was published in 1992, which is 24 years ago. That's prolific. In all of these books, Jodi tackles many timely and very challenging subjects: school shooting, priestly pedophilia, homophobia, medical malpractice, and now racism. She brings her reader into the mind and heart of characters, some of whom we really don't want to be in, and poses questions rather than giving us the answers. Please welcome Jodi Picoult.
Okay, the first thing I have to do is disrobe. I wasn't planning on a striptease, but I'm hot in this room. So. Second thing that I have to do is, this is new for me, but I need reading glasses. So anyway, today what I'm going to do is talk to you guys about Small Great Things. And I don't want to say much until I do the reading, because I want the main character in this book to introduce herself to you. All I'm going to tell you is that this is Ruth Jefferson. She is an African-American nurse with 20 years of labor and delivery experience at a hospital in New Haven. So let's let Ruth talk to you for a little bit. The most beautiful baby I ever saw was born without a face. From the neck down, he was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, chubby belly. But where his ears should have been, there was a twist of lips and a single tooth. Instead of a face, there was a swirling eddy of skin. His mother, my patient, had received prenatal care, including an ultrasound, but the baby had been positioned in a way that the facial deformity hadn't been visible. No one was expecting this. Maybe for that very reason, she chose to deliver at our little cottage hospital and not Yale, New Haven, which is better equipped for emergencies. She labored for 16 hours before she delivered. The doctor lifted the baby, and there was nothing but silence. "Is he all right?" the mother asked, panicking. "Why isn't he crying?" The OB silently met my gaze and turned back to the parents. In soft words, he said their child had profound birth defects that were incompatible with life. On a birth pavilion, death is a more common patient than you'd think. When we have anencephalies or fetal deaths, we know that the parents still have to bond with and mourn for that baby. So I cleaned him and swaddled him the way I would any other newborn, while the conversation behind me stopped and started like a car choking through the winter, questions no one ever wants to ask and no one ever wants to answer. The mother was still crying when I settled the baby in the crook of her elbow. His tiny hands windmilled. She wore an expression I've only seen in paintings in museums, of a love and a grief so fierce they forged together to create some new raw emotion. I turned to the father. "Would you like to hold your son?" He looked like he was about to be sick. "I can't." He bolted from the room. I cornered him in the parents' lounge. "Your wife and your son need you." "That's not my son. That thing is not going to be on this earth for very long, which means you better give him all the love you had stored up for his lifetime right now." When we entered the hospital room, his wife was still nuzzling the infant. I took the tiny bundle from her arms and handed the baby to her husband. I've thought about my actions, if I did the right thing, if it was my place. When the father started to cry, the sobs shook his body like a hurricane bends a tree. He sank down beside his wife on the hospital bed. They took turns holding their son for 10 hours. That mother, she even tried to let him nurse. I couldn't stop staring because it was the most remarkable thing I'd ever seen. Love has nothing to do with what you're looking at and everything to do with who's looking. When the infant died, it was peaceful. We made casts of the newborn's hand and foot for the parents to keep. I heard the same couple came back 2 years later and delivered a healthy daughter. Just goes to show you, every baby is born beautiful. It's what we project on them that makes them ugly. On Thursdays, my shift goes from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. We usually have 2 nurses on the birthing pavilion, 3 if we're swimming in human resources. I note how many delivery suites are occupied, 3 right now, a nice slow start to the day. Marie, the charge nurse, is already in the room where we have our morning meeting when I come inside, but Corinne, the second nurse on shift, is missing. "What's it going to be today?" Marie asks. "Flat tire," I reply. This guessing game is a routine. What excuse will Corinne use for being late? That was last week. I'm going with the flu. She looks up from the regional section of the paper. "I saw Edison's name in here again." My son has made the highest honors list for every semester of his high school career, but just like I tell him, that's no reason to boast. There are a lot of bright kids in this town. Still, Marie says, for a boy like Edison to be so successful, well, a boy like Edison. I know what she's saying, even if she's careful not to spell it out. There are not many black kids in the high school, and as far as I know, Edison's the only one on the high honors list. Comments like this feel like paper cuts, but I've worked with Marie for over 10 years now, so I try to ignore the sting. White people don't mean half the offensive things that come out of their mouths. Corinne explodes into the room. "Sorry I'm late. The stupid tire I replaced last week has a leak or something." Marie reaches into her pocket and pulls out $1, which she flicks across the table at me. I laugh. "All right," Marie says. "Floor report. Room 2 is Jessica Myers. She had a vaginal delivery this morning at 3 a.m. "I'll take her," Corinne and I say in unison. Everyone wants the patient who's already delivered. It's the easier job. "I had her during active labor," I point out. "Right," Marie says. "Ruth, she's yours." "Room 3 is Thea McVaughan. She's in active labor." "I've got her," Corinne says. We only take 1 active labor patient at a time if we can help it, which means that the 3rd patient will be mine. Room 5 is a recovery. Brittany Bauer was a gestational diabetic, baby's on quarterly blood sugars. "Got it." I push away from the table to go find Lucille, the night nurse, who hands me Brittany Bauer's file. "Davis," I read. "That's the baby?" "Yeah, I haven't done the bath or the newborn assessment yet." "No problem. That it?" The dad's name is Turk," Lucille says. "There's something a little off about him." "Like Creeper Dad?" "Last year we had a father who was flirting with the nursing student in the room during his wife's delivery. When she wound up having a C-section, instead of standing behind the drape near his wife's head, he strolled across the OR and said to the nursing student, 'Is it hot in here or is it just you?'" No, he's just sketchy. I don't know, I can't put my finger on it. I knock softly. "I'm Ruth. I'm going to be your nurse today." I smile down at the baby cradled in Brittany's arms. "Isn't he a sweetie? What's his name?" I ask, although I already know. It's a means to start a conversation. Brittany doesn't answer. She looks at her husband, a hulking guy who's sitting on the edge of his chair. He's got military short hair and he's bouncing the heel of one boot. I get what Lucille saw in him. Turk Bauer makes me think of a power line that snapped during a storm and lies across the road just waiting for something to brush against it so it can shoot sparks. It doesn't matter if you're shy or modest. Nobody who's just had a baby stays quiet for long. They want to share this life-changing moment. But Brittany, well, it's almost like she needs permission to speak. Domestic abuse, I wonder? "Davis," she chokes out. "His name is Davis." "Well, hello, Davis. Would you mind if I take a listen to his heart and lungs?" Her arms clamp tighter on the newborn. "I can do it right here. You don't have to let go of him." You have to cut a new parent a little bit of slack, especially one who's already been told her baby's blood sugar is too low. So I tuck the thermometer under Davis's armpit and get a normal reading. I look at the whorls of his hair. A patch of white can signify hearing loss. An alternating hair pattern can flag metabolic issues. I press my stethoscope against the baby's back, listening to his lungs. I slide my hand between him and his mother, listening to his heart. Whoosh. It's so faint that I think it's a mistake. I listen again, trying to make sure it wasn't a fluke. Turk stands up so that he's towering over me. Nerves look different on fathers. They get combative sometimes, as if they could bluster away whatever's wrong. I hear a very slight murmur, I say delicately, but it could be nothing. I'll have the pediatrician take a listen. While I'm talking, trying to be as calm as possible, I do another blood sugar. It's an AccuCheck, which means we get instant results. "No, this is great news," I say, trying to give the Bowers something positive to hold on to. "Davis's sugar is much better." I walk to the sink and run water, fill a plastic bowl, set it on the warmer. "Why don't I get him cleaned up and we can try nursing again?" I scoop the baby up, place Davis on the warmer, and begin my exam. I can hear Brittany and Turk whispering fiercely as I check the fontanelles on the baby's head for suture lines to make sure the bones aren't overriding each other. The parents are worried, and that's normal. A lot of patients don't like to take the nurse's opinion on any medical issue. They need to hear it from the doctor, even though nurses are often the ones who first notice a quirk or a symptom. I look for facial bruising, hematoma, abnormal shaping of the skull. I check the palmar creases in his tiny hands. I measure the circumference of his head and the length of his squirming body. I scan the base of the spine for dimples or hair tufts or any other indicator of neural tube defect. The whispering behind me has stopped, but instead of feeling more comfortable, it feels ominous. What do they think I'm doing wrong? By the time I flip him back over, Davis's eyes are starting to drift shut. Babies usually get sleepy a couple of hours after delivery, which is one reason to do the bath now. It'll wake him up long enough to try to feed again. I diaper him, wrap him up in a blanket like a burrito. The last thing I do is put an ID band on him that will match the ones his parents have and fasten a tiny electronic security bracelet on his ankle. I can feel the parents' eyes hot on my back. There, I say, handing the infant to Brittany again. Clean as a whistle. Now, let's see if we can get him to nurse. I reach down to help position the baby, but Brittany flinches. Get away from her, Turk Bauer says. I want to talk to your boss. They are the first words he's spoken to me in the 20 minutes I've been in this room. I'm pretty sure he doesn't want to tell Marie what a stellar job I've done. I find her filling out a chart. We've got a problem in 5, I say. The father wants to see you. What happened? Absolutely nothing, I reply. I told them I heard what sounded like a murmur and I'd contact the pediatrician, and I bathed the baby and did his exam. I must be doing a pretty awful job of hiding my feelings, though, because Marie looks at me sympathetically. Maybe they're worried about the baby's heart. I'm just a step behind her as we walk in. I understand you wanted to talk to me, Mr. Bauer? Marie asks. That nurse, Turk says. I don't want her touching my son again. Heat spreads from the collar of my scrubs. No one likes to be called out in front of her supervisor. I can assure you that Ruth is one of the best nurses we have, Mr. Bauer. If there's a formal complaint, I don't want her or anyone who looks like her touching my son, the father interrupts, and he folds his arms across his chest. He's pushed up his sleeves while I was out of the room. Running from wrist to elbow is the tattoo of a Confederate flag. Marie stops talking. For a moment, I honestly don't understand. And then it hits me. They don't have a problem with what I've done, just with who I am. That's Ruth. So what I'm going to do now is talk to you guys a little bit about where this book came from, how I did the research for it, and honestly, why this book is different than anything I've ever written, because it has very much changed me, the way I think, and the way I live my life. 20 years ago, about 25 years ago, actually, I tried to write about racism. I was living in New York City, and there was a story in the news about a black undercover cop who had been shot 4 times in the back by white colleagues on the subway, even though he was wearing this wristband called the color of the day that identified him as an undercover cop. And I started writing the book, and I just couldn't do it. I could not create an authentic story or authentic characters. And I really struggled and asked myself, is this even my story to tell? Do I have the right to write a story about racism? I am a white woman. What do I know about this? And then, over the years, I would think about writing about racism again, and I would start to play devil's advocate. I would say, hey, you write all the time in the voices of people you're not. You write as men. You write as school shooters and Holocaust survivors and rape victims. You've never been any of those either. Why is this different? Well, the reason it's different is because race is different. Racism is different. It's really hard to talk about without offending people, and so as a result, often we just choose not to talk about it at all. Fast forward to 2012. I read an article again about a story that comes out of Flint, Michigan. An African-American nurse with 20 years of experience on a labor and delivery ward helps deliver a baby, and afterward the father calls in her supervisor and says he does not want her or anyone who looks like her to touch the infant. He pushes up his sleeve and he reveals a swastika tattoo. He was a skinhead. The hospital put a Post-it note on the baby's file saying no African-American personnel to touch this infant. She sued the nurse, and she settled out of court, and I hope she got a giant payout. But I thought, what if? What if she had been the only person in the room with that baby when something went wrong? What if she had to make a choice between following her supervisor's orders or saving a baby's life? What if, as a result of that, she wound up on trial, being defended by a white public defender who, like me, like many people I know, would never consider themselves to be racists? What if I could tell the story in 3 different points of view? The African-American nurse, the white public defender, and the skinhead father, as they all had to examine their beliefs about power, privilege, and race. Suddenly I knew I was going to finish this book. And there were 2 reasons why. I had changed my focus, and I had changed my audience. I was not writing a book to tell people of color how hard their lives are. That's not my story to tell. I shouldn't be telling it. And frankly, there are fantastic people of color who are authors who are doing that job every day very, very well without me. I was writing to white people. I was writing to people who look like me to say, it's really easy to point to a skinhead and say, that's a racist. It's a little harder to point to ourselves and say the same thing. This was the hardest book that I have ever written. I could not ask all of you to look at your biases until I had done it myself. So I started off by reading everything I could get my hands on by social justice and racial justice educators, just so I could begin to come up with the vocabulary that I needed. Then I went to a social justice workshop. And I went in there thinking, I'm a pretty good person, I'm pretty open-minded. I left every single night in tears as I began to see that I wasn't nearly as blameless as I wanted to pretend that I was. I remember, I'll never forget, this one woman who is an Asian American woman who broke down in tears talking about her love-hate affair with eyeliner, because she couldn't use it easily on her own features, but it was the standard of beauty that she had been brought up with in this country. And then there was an African-American woman who stood up one day and explained how exhausting it was to put on a mask every morning so that she could be the person that everyone else needed her to be, and how she never had the opportunity to just be herself and let her guard down. And I thought, I'm never going to have either of those experiences. I'm never going to have either of those experiences. I met with multiple women of color who were kind enough to overlook my ignorance about their upbringing and spent over 100 hours of interview time with me, telling me about their hopes, their fears, their failures, their successes. There was the new mom who had just had her second son, who came to me in tears one day it was the morning after yet another shooting by the police of an unarmed African-American man. And she said, how am I supposed to keep my son safe when he grows up? How do I teach him to not be black? There was the young woman who had graduated from Vassar College who told me that she carries a Vassar water bottle with her everywhere. And when she's on public transportation, she puts it next to her with the word Vassar facing out so that as people walk by and see the empty seat, they'll know she's safe. And again, I thought, these are experiences I've never even thought about, and that's a privilege too. They were also kind enough to be my sensitivity readers. These women read the voice of Ruth before this book was published, and they suggested changes, and I made changes so that the voice would be as authentic as I could possibly create as a white woman. I couldn't have written this book without them, and I shouldn't have written this book without them. And then I talked to skinheads, 2 former skinheads, who told me what it was like to join a life of hate and how they got out of a life of hate and why. I learned so much writing this book. I learned that just because you choose not to talk about racism because it's messy and scary and hard doesn't mean that you're not part of the problem. And the metaphor that I like to think about, those stupid moving walkways at the airport that you just stand on and you get to the other side, or sometimes you pull your bag on and you get there faster? Well, that's kind of what this is like. A skinhead is the guy who walks on the moving walkway and gets to the other side faster. If you don't talk about racism and you just stand still, you're going to get to the same place. It just is going to take you a little longer than the skinhead. If you actively want to fight racism, you've got to turn around and start running. I learned that racism isn't just prejudice. It's power plus prejudice. And that's like a real seismic mind shift. Think about it. You could take every skinhead on the planet, ship them off to Mars, and you would still have racism in the US. That's because racism is systemic and institutional, but it's both perpetuated and dismantled by individual acts. One of the things that I talked about with these women of color, I had a mom ask me, how often do you talk about racism with your kids? And I was like, sometimes if something happens in the news. She said, I talk about it every single night. Do you know why? Because it's a matter of life and death. Ignorance is also a privilege. And the thing is, although it's really easy for us sometimes, look around, this is a pretty white crowd, and you live in one of the whitest states, it's really easy for us to know that racism can make it hard for people of color to achieve success. But it's a little harder to admit to ourselves that there aren't just headwinds of racism. There are also tailwinds of racism. And those are the things that benefit people who look like me. We like to think that when we succeed, it's luck or hard work, but that's not always the case. Sometimes the reason that you succeed is because you have directly been given an opportunity that a person of color did not have. And it might be something you don't even know about. Like maybe you got an apartment because your landlord didn't want to rent to someone of color. But maybe it's also because your life and your upbringing were a little different. When you got into a good school and you did well on your SATs, perhaps you thought that was because you'd been a good student and you'd studied. Well, it also could be because when you were little, your mom read to you every night, and you grew up with this sense of education being important. And a person of color might have had a mom who had to work 3 jobs and wasn't there to read to them every night, and it was starting at a disadvantage from you. When you begin to unravel that, you begin to see that the American dream isn't really quite so dreamy, and that is a real change in the prism of how you can see the world. I know that talking about racism is scary, and I know that we don't like to be bad people, and I know viscerally that most of us would rather, crawl into a hole than say something that's going to be offensive. One of the most amazing things about fiction is that it can give you the tools to have a conversation about real life that you didn't have in the first place. And what I really hope is that when you read this book, you get that vocabulary. Start by talking. Read this book with someone you know who's safe, your best friend, your mom, your daughter, whoever. Sit down and talk about the characters and then segue into a discussion about what's going on in the world, because you'll be able to after you start with the fiction in here. And a lot of people who have read the book, I realize you guys are slackers, you've had the book for like 6 minutes, right? You haven't finished it yet? A lot of people who have read it write me and say, okay, you're right, I feel like I need to make a change, I need to make a difference. What do I do? How do I make a change in the world? Because let's face it, one of us alone is not going to get rid of racism. So how can you make tiny changes in your own life that sort of alter the fabric of the world a little bit? Well, I can give you examples of what I learned. Again, I'm not a social justice educator. I'm just someone on a journey, and we're all at different places on that path. But these are some of the things that I've learned that I can give to you guys today. And what I'm going to start with are the things you should not do. Because a lot of times people do things that they think are well-meaning, and you couldn't be more wrong. So to start with, do not say, I'm colorblind. When you say you're colorblind, what a person of color actually hears is you're totally ignoring the effect that racism has had on my life. And we know what you mean, but that's not the right way to say it. You need to be race aware more than you need to be colorblind. Don't say, well, I'm a minority too. Now that's actually a good thing. Let's say you are gay or female or Jewish or any of a million other things that could put you into a category that would be considered a minority. That's going to help you find the empathy that you need to put yourself in the shoes of someone who wakes up every day as a person of color. But when you say, well, I'm also a minority, again, what you're doing is kind of robbing them of their voice at that moment, and that narrative is a little less important at that moment. Don't say, I have black friends. Okay, because what that does is make your black friend the representative for an entire race. You wouldn't want that done of you either. And here's an FYI, if you have a black friend and you haven't talked to her about racism, you don't have a black friend. Don't assume that you need to be present at every conversation about race. This is a really hard one for white people because we are used to always having our opinions heard and having them matter. But the truth is that in communities of color, they have fantastic leaders and they have visionaries. They don't need us to come in and solve problems. What they really need is us to be willing to help if they ask for it. And so that kind of leads into the next one, which is don't be a savior. You aren't trying to tell people of color how to live their lives. The best thing you can do is say, do you need help? What can I do for you? And very often what that means, because you have that space at the table and that constant flow of audience that wants to hear your opinion, sometimes the best way to help someone is to assemble a room like this, full of white people, thinking they're going to hear you, and then say, are we listening? Are we listening? Great. And step aside and let the voice of someone who hasn't traditionally been heard step up to that mic or metaphorical mic and speak. This is a big one, and it's a controversial one. Do not say, all lives matter. Okay, this is the thing about the Black Lives Matter movement. We know all lives matter. I mean, come on, of course they do. But imagine that you've broken your arm and you go to the doctor and you say, I've broken my arm. Could you put a cast on this arm? And he says to you, well, you know, all bones matter. You're going to say, that's awesome, but this is the broken one. That's kind of what I'm getting at. All lives can't matter until everyone is equal. And right now, it is very clear by what we see in the news that Black lives are more dispensable than white lives. To that end, until Black lives matter, all lives can't matter. Okay, so now what do you do? Now that I've told you what not to do, how can you make changes that are positive ones? Well, the first one is to know the difference between equal and equitable. Equal means the same. Equitable means fair. So let's say you're a teacher and you have a student who's blind in your class. Are you going to give that student the same test that you give everybody else? Of course not. You're going to give her a test in Braille with the same information on it. That's the difference between equal and equitable. What you want to do is make sure that there are multiple pathways to success, and you need to make sure that you level the playing field for everybody. That's what's really important to think about, and to understand that there are people who are going to take different trajectories to success. Make yourself uneasy. If you look around right now, you're going to see that most people here look like you. Imagine what it would be like to be the one African-American person in this room right now. Put yourself in that situation. Go somewhere where you are not the predominant majority and see how you feel. It's going to be a little bit uncomfortable and scary, and that's a really important thing to carry with you when you are thinking about conversations about race. Educate yourself. I want you to raise your hand if you know who Rosa Parks is. I want you to raise your hand if you know who Lewis Latimer is. Yes, you! Woo! Okay, everyone else here, that's your homework. Find out who Lewis Latimer is, and then ask yourself, why didn't my education cover that? It's not the role of people of color to teach us about their culture and their history and their successes. We should go out and figure those things out on our own. I learned a ton when I was writing this book, and over again, I was thinking, how come I didn't know that? How come I didn't know that? Notice your tailwinds. Again, this is that way that you notice that there are boosts for you, and a really good way to do something like this is coming up. Everyone's probably going to celebrate Thanksgiving, right? Everyone has a racist uncle who comes and makes an offensive joke at Thanksgiving, right? Right? So this year, instead of saying, oh, you know, Uncle Bob's 90, he's never going to change, this year, let it be the year that you sit down with Uncle Bob and say, hey, you know, Uncle Bob, you really shouldn't say that, and here's why. You know, because maybe he's never been called out on it. You don't know. Maybe you will change his mind. Maybe you won't. But if you don't have that conversation, you're never going to know. So use those tailwinds. Use that privilege to good. And talk. Talk to the people who look like you. That's what I'm doing every day on this book tour, to people like you. This is my way, Small Great Things, of talking to a white audience and saying, here's what I've learned. Don't you want to learn too? Find those conversations and talk even if you're going to say the wrong thing. I can promise you, I am going to screw up royally on this tour. I hope it's not tomorrow on CBS This Morning, but it's going to happen. And when I do, I'm going to say, I am so sorry. Thank you for telling me that. I've learned from it, and I'm going to move forward. It is much more important that we start talking too, instead of being paralyzed by our fear of saying the wrong thing. And here is the easiest way that you guys can make a very subtle change. If you all have a debate hangover like I do, you are probably aware of the term implicit bias. It's been bandied around a lot in politics lately. Well, a really good way to figure out whether you have implicit bias is to look at your bookshelf. How many authors of color do you read in ratio to the white authors that are on your bookshelf? Take a look and see. If it's not 1-to-1, why is that? If you haven't read an author of color lately, I wholly encourage you to do so. There are so many amazing, amazing authors of color. Colson Whitehead, Octavia Butler, Celeste Ng, Nicola Yoon, Jesmyn Ward, Toni Morrison, Gloria Naylor, Sandra Cisneros, Christina Enriquez, Sherman Alexie. I could go on, and I could go on, and I could go on. If you only read voices that are like your own, you're never going to expand. If we really want to broaden our minds, we have to read people who don't sound like us. And that's a really easy fix, and something you can do right now. A really great little mnemonic device that I stole from an activist on Twitter named Kayla Reed is the word ally. A, always center the oppressed. Remember, it's just not about you this time. L, listen to those who live in the oppression. L, leverage your privilege. And Y, yield that microphone. If you kind of keep those little 4 things in your head, it becomes a lot easier to use your voice and to start talking about racism. Now, I know this is terrifying, I know it's scary, and I know it's quite a call to action. I can also tell you that if I can do it, surely you can. My children will tell you that I rarely talked about race for the first 48 years of my life, and now I can't shut up about race. But I will leave you with a tiny bit of hope. The structures in your brain that make it possible for us to hate people we do not know are the same physiological structures of the brain that allow you to feel compassion for people you don't know. So technically that means that the same part of the brain that allows a hate crime to happen is the part of the brain that also will lead you to donate money to the family of a small African-American boy who is accidentally killed by the police that you will never meet. And that kind of tells me that love really might be the flip side of hate. So with that, I am going to take off my reading glasses, look at all of you, not blurry, and invite you to ask me questions. And they could be about this book, they could be about my research, it could be about anything at all. I would only ask that you don't give away the ending of anything, because that makes me mad. So, has anyone got a question for me? Yeah. How is the book different from Change of Heart? Hugely different, because I don't think of that book as being about racism. The other difference for me is that with Change of Heart, I was going into that thinking about the death penalty, thinking about my opinions on the death penalty. I did not change my mind or my opinions. I changed my arguments for... Well, not my heart, but it really changed my... the reasons that I thought I was against the death penalty turned out I could poke holes in them at certain points. And so when I was writing that book, I wound up finding the real arguments that I was against it. For me, the real reason, what it boils down to with the death penalty is that it really comes down to believing that people can or cannot change. And if you really believe that people are irredeemable, then you want them excised from the gene pool. And I personally don't feel that. So, and in fact, I mean, the skinheads that I talk to are an excellent example of that. Former skinheads. They would not like to be called skinheads today. Anybody else? Yeah.
What made you decide on the title?
Great question. What made me decide on the title? My publisher, because they didn't like my first title. For a long time, this book was called Living Color, which I still like, but I really do like this title. This actually came from a woman who works at my British publishing company. So Small Great Things is a reference to a quote that is often attributed to Martin Luther King Jr., which is, if I cannot do great things, I can do small things in a great way. And it really spoke to me, to the message of this book, which is, again, that although racism is big, messy, institutional, systemic, we do make individual choices every single day that can begin to tear that wall down. And I just thought that was perfect. Yeah?
Can you tell a little bit more about your experience with the
I would love to, yeah. So I met with two former skinheads. The first guy is a man named Timothy Zoll. He is from California in the Orange County area. He, in the 80s, was part of a very violent gang that ran, basically one night they went out to beat up gay people. And he beat up a guy, smashed his head in, and left him dying on a curb. Years later, when he wound up leaving the movement, he left, and the first thing he did was write a letter to the rabbi of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, because he had at one point during his career as a skinhead written a very offensive letter to this man. So he wrote the guy and he said, I would like to apologize. And the rabbi wrote him back and said, would you like to come work for me? And he came to the Simon Wiesenthal Center and he started working there and explaining what it was like to live a life of hate. Every day he would talk to groups. One day he was sitting in the cafeteria and he looked up and he saw the man that he had beaten up and left for dead. And he was a docent at the Simon Wiesenthal Center and was taking a tour through. They saw each other over a period of months. They slowly connected and talked and worked through what had happened. And now they are friends. They spend holidays at each other's houses, and they spend days giving talks together about hate and about leaving hate. The other man that I spoke with was from Philly. He ran a very violent skinhead crew in Philly, and he, at one point, had gone to jail and realized in jail that he had more in common with the young African-American kids in jail than he did with the young white kids. And they used to talk about the girls that they missed and the food that they missed. And then he got out of prison, and one of his first jobs was to go work for a Jewish man. And as a skinhead, he had been taught that Jews are stingy and greedy and that this guy was going to totally rob him of the money that he was due. So he was working for this man, and on the day before he was supposed to end his contract with the guy, he was like moving furniture or something. The Jewish man called him in, and he said, here it comes, here it comes. He was ready for the guy to say, I'm not paying you. And the guy said to him, you've done such an extraordinary job, I wanted to give you a bonus, and paid him double what he had contracted. And Frankie realized, how many times do you have to keep making exceptions to the rules before you realize the rules are wrong? And that was what led him on his journey out of hate. To leave a hate group, they had to be beaten up quite badly. And then after that, they are left alone for the most part. They both, Frankie now runs this group called Harmony Through Hockey that helps kids learn about diversity and fight on a playing field rather than a playground. And he also works with the government now to help find white supremacist cells that are online. Because that's the biggest change, and this is some of the stuff that they taught me, the biggest change that has happened since the 1980s, which was kind of the heyday of white supremacy, is that instead of violent crews roaming the streets of inner cities, now they are all online, they have grown their hair out, they look like you and me, which is actually a little more terrifying. And the way that they incite hate is by creating fear. So they might go on Yom Kippur to a temple parking lot and put the final call from the Nation of Islam under all of the windshield wipers of the cars that are parked there, just to make people panic. They might go into a traditionally white space and put up anti-white propaganda, again, just to make people feel like there are many, many threats to a white community. But they try to do that by inciting fear, and they have a very strong presence online. And they are also, you will be happy to know, stockpiling guns in Vermont and New Hampshire for the racial holy war that they think is coming. They told me some of the most amazing things that I learned that were so incredibly upsetting to me were two things that stand out. They told me about Aryan Independence Day and Hitler's birthday celebrations, which happen in like big fields, basically up here for the most part. And, people pitch tents, and there are all kinds of white power bands and speeches. They have a cross lighting at night. And then they also have kiddie games. Kiddie games like, for example, Pin the Star on the Jew, or the piñata that is an African-American man hanging from a noose, or target shooting. And on the targets are pictures of Obama's profile. And this is still going on right now. The other thing they said, and this blew me away, and especially in this political season, they said the KKK is a joke. Everyone knows those are the old guys who are sitting around drinking beer talking about their heyday. But they are not a force anymore. The new equivalent of the KKK is the Tea Party. And what they showed me, and this was astounding, is a speech from the early 1960s, a KKK speech, and then they held it up against the speech of a Tea Party candidate. And it was almost identical, word for word, with the exception of the fact that the word Jew is now federal government, the gay slur is now the social ilk of this country, and the N-word is now welfare. And I urge you to go do that yourself, do that research. It's terrifying. What I will tell you is that these guys really have had a complete change of heart. They actively work to combat racism, each of them in their own way. The guy from LA is married to a Jewish woman now. I mean, that's a pretty big turnaround. And, I left there feeling like if these guys could make a change, well, surely the rest of us can. Yeah?
In Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, was that part of your research?
I actually read that after I had done the research, but I think he's brilliant. I think he's terrific. And I used so many books for research, and I do have in the back of the book a list of the resources that I used in case you want to follow up on them. Yeah.
I understand you did research for your book at the Birthing Pavilion.
Well, actually, the birthing pavilion came to me, but yes. Yeah. Sure. So one night I had like 8 labor and delivery nurses to my house, and we basically sat down, and here's what I've learned. I will never be a labor and delivery nurse because I can't remember the alphabet soup of all of the terms that they use. And when I did this reading for you, I actually cut half of the jargon because you wouldn't understand it either unless you're a labor and delivery nurse. But it's like, let me see if I can read you one of them because it's so weird. G1, P0 at 41 weeks and 3 days. It's like all like that. They sound like, I don't know, like they're on Deep Space Nine or something in a cockpit. But actually, they were really great. And what I loved about speaking to all the L&D nurses was that they all had stories. They all had stories about, like funny things that happened, really poignant things that happened. There was a really cool story that one of them told me that actually I used in the book, about how there was a Muslim couple that came in to deliver a baby, and they asked if the first voice that the baby heard could be the father's. And, the labor and delivery nurse was like, well, I can't make any promises. I'll try, but if something goes wrong, we have to start talking, And she communicated this request to the OB, and it was an uncomplicated delivery. And the reason that they wanted that was because, I guess, traditionally for this man, the first thing he did was take his baby and he whispered the adhan to him, which is a prayer in Islam. And it was this really beautiful moment. And I just loved that example as a counterpart to the request that this white supremacist couple makes instead. So everything that you see in here is probably from one of those lovely ladies who gave their time to me and their stories. And hopefully it's not one of you who delivered. Yes.
I'm a labor and delivery doctor, and I believe that labor and deliveries are very spiritual places.
Well, having had 3 children a long time ago, yeah, it's a spiritual journey. But I'd say what I remember more about it was like, I remember my husband who went into full coach mode at one point, and he was, I was delivering actually my middle son. We were down in Worcester, and every time, I can't believe I'm sharing a birth story with all of you, but every time I started to have contractions. They were really bad, and they made me lie down, but then they'd make me get out of bed to start the contractions again, right? Which was this horrible, vicious cycle. And I started walking, and Tim's next to me, and I was having a contraction. I'm leaning on the wall, and this is my second kid. And he goes, "You are doing great. This is the hardest part." And I grabbed him by the throat, and I said, "This is not the hardest part." So I guess it depends on what you consider spiritual. It was definitely a cleansing moment. But what I do think is that I still remember it. There is absolutely nothing, if you've had a child, there's nothing like that moment that you see and hold that baby for the first time. And you're a family unit. Having going from something that's internal to external like that is amazing. And I do remember, I've actually used this metaphor in a different book, and I'm not sure which book it was, but it's a little bit like suddenly realizing your heart is living outside your body. I don't know if that answered your question, but it was kind of fun to revisit that. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, for me, this book, the labor and delivery stuff in it was very important for me because it had to be accurate, and it had to be we had to be able to see Ruth in her extreme competency as a nurse, because she is. But to me, I think for her it's really hard, because a lot of people who have done this for many, many years, it's a calling, really. I mean, I would say that being a labor and delivery nurse is a calling. And a lot of the nurses I spoke with talked to me about, really, in what other medical profession can you imagine spending that much one-on-one time with a patient? I couldn't think of anything else. And the bond that you forge is fast and it's fierce. And, I think that when Ruth has that taken away from her, she is very much at sea. She doesn't know who she is anymore. What would I recommend to someone who's writing a book for the first time? What I would recommend is find a topic that keeps you up at night, that you can't stop thinking about. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. I think that when you start a book, the thing that's scariest about starting a book, whether it's fiction or whether it's a memoir, is that it's big. It's scary because it's big. How am I going to fill all these pages? And what I actually usually tell people is, don't think of it as a book. Write memories, moments, conversations. Think of yourself of making quilt squares, and then worry about sewing the quilt together. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think we're running towards the end of the questions anyway, so.
Follow-up.
Yes.
Ladies, what would be your advice for a first-time author whose book is done and they're ready to go on their book tour?
Okay. What would be my advice for a first-time author whose book is done, but they're ready to go on their book tour? Are you published?
In April.
Congratulations. Great. So this is How Do You Survive on Book Tour 101. Yeah. So, no. What I would say, honestly, look, if they're sending you on a book tour, you're very lucky, because they're not. Okay. And I was going to say, in today's day and age, that's pretty rare. So honestly, here's the thing. Most people make the mistake of thinking that once I get the publishing contract, that's my brass ring. I've grabbed it. And then all of a sudden your book comes out and you're like, nobody knows my book is out. Why? Here's what I really recommend if you are starting out as an author. Your publisher, realistically, is not going to pay for anything. They're not going to give you marketing money because nobody knows who you are yet. So you have to be your own one-woman PR force. I recommend going to local bookstores and saying, I would like to do a reading. Would you host me? I can get you 50 people here that night. And then beating the bushes so that all of your friends and neighbors and relatives come. I would go to local book clubs and offer to talk to your book club if they read your book, because that often is very interesting for a book club. I did that a ton when I was starting out. And go to book fairs. Get yourself out on the road so that people know what you've written and know who you are, and continue to get in front of groups of people who will read your book and talk about it. The one kind of advertising that you can't pay for is word of mouth. But luckily, it's also the kind of advertising that you can create. Last question. Yes?
Changing subjects. I'm a fan of the Trumbull Hall Troop. New for them.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to hear that. This lovely lady is a fan of the Trumbull Hall Troop. I never get to talk about this because I'm never in my local community. So over 10 years ago, a friend and I started a local teen theater troupe called the Trumbull Hall Troop, which is in the Upper Valley and which performs original musicals that are written by me and my friend Ellen Wilbur, who is a music teacher and composer at Indian River School. And we donate all of our proceeds to charity. Over the course of a decade, we've raised over $125,000 for local charities in this area. And It's so much fun. I get so much out of it. In fact, funny you should ask. I was home for a day in the middle of this book tour, and on Sunday I went to go see a producer's run of the show that they're doing this November. And we're doing something a little different this year, although we are very excited and plan to go back to our originals. Last year, in fact, we wrote an original called When in Rome, which was all about Greco-Roman myths that were all mashed together with 1950s music. And many of our shows, if you are an educator, are licensed at PlayScripts and have been performed as far away as New Zealand and Zambia, which is really cool. But this year, to shake things up, and because I really wanted to show you guys how much talent we have in this little troupe, we licensed a show for the first time, and we are performing Legally Blonde. It's at the Opera House, Lebanon Opera House, on November 4th, 5th, and 6th. If you go to trumbullhalltroupe.com, you can get tickets. They're right now reservable. You do not pay for tickets. We just ask for a donation at the door, and all of your money goes to charity. This year, we are supporting 3 charities. We're supporting the Upper Valley Haven and CHAD, and also Zienzeli, which provides money and support to HIV and AIDS orphans in Zimbabwe, but is locally based. So we are really proud of our kids and the work they do, and I can tell you from yesterday, it's going to be an awesome show. So definitely get down there. It will be the next time, coincidentally, that I am in the Upper Valley, so I'll see you all there, I hope. But thank you for asking that question, and I love that the community has supported us so much. It's very important for local charities as well. Do we have time for one more or not? One more. You. Yes.
I wanted to make an observation.
Oh, okay.
The book is about racism, and the topic that you get there with is labor and delivery, but I think with your opening remarks about how to look at ourselves and where we have racist views, that's also a labor. And coming out the other side is a delivery.
I think that's a beautiful metaphor, yeah. Yes, I'm going to try really hard. This lovely lady said that metaphorically, from where I started talking about racism and what created this book, that very much the struggles that we go through when we're addressing racism are a labor, and hopefully when we come out the other side, it will be a delivery. And so it's a nice way to it's actually a very beautiful way to end this talk, so thanks for that. Thank you all so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.